Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, and I'm director of the Lloyd Library Museum. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Visions of Nature, Agriculture and Water Management Practices of the Ancient Maya with David Lentz. This is the first lecture in conjunction with our photo focus exhibition, Visions of Nature Across Time and Place. David's work is near and dear to our hearts. In fact, the exhibition poster, which you see and also on the banner here, was based on his discovery. And you can see more examples of photos from this collection in our exhibition. One of our founders, Curtis Gates Lloyd, was an early ethnobotanist. When David was researching here Mesoamerican agriculture in 2021, he asked if Curtis Gates Lloyd had ever traveled to Mexico, and if so, were there pictures? And as they say, the rest is history. We shared his excitement with him, which he described as hitting the lottery. We'll hear more about Mayan life and where that discovery led him this evening. Following tonight's program will be a question and answer session. We ask that the in-person audience hold your questions to the end. The Zoom audience can enter them in the chat, and we'll make sure that David gets them. David Lentz is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Cincinnati, where he brings together anthropology and botany. As director of graduate studies at the New York Botanical Garden, vice president of scientific affairs at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and president of the Society for Economic Botany. He has been a fellow at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library in Washington, D.C. since 2021, continuing his research for a book project on ancient Mesoamerican agriculture. It's now my great pleasure to welcome David Lentz. Hi, David.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much. That is very good. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Patricia, for inviting me. It's a delight to be here, and it's great to see so many smiling faces here in the audience. And I get to talk about things that are near and dear to my heart. And so tonight I'll be talking about sort of a book project I've been working on, not making as much progress as I would like to, but I have lots of ideas, and I'm going to share some of those with you tonight. So tonight I'm going to be talking about agriculture and water management practices of the ancient Maya. And as Patricia mentioned, a lot of the images that I got here from the Lloyd Library that were created by Curtis Lloyd were very key in helping us to understand some of the agricultural features that we see in the Maya area. We'll get to that in just a moment. Okay. So did somebody say that they knew what temple? This is from Tikal. Did you?
Temple 1, Tikal?
That is, no, that's not. We have Temple 1 in here later.
Okay.
This is Temple 3. And most people don't see it very much. And if I could show you, I took the picture long ways, and the whole picture goes all the way down to the floor here. So this is just the top of it. So it's a little deceptive, but it does look very much like Temple 1. So you're very close there. So you've been to Tikal, obviously. Yes. Okay. Who else has been to Tikal or to the Maya world at all? Okay. So quite a few people. Excellent. So join me on this journey into Maya agriculture. So this is some of the places we're going to be looking at, talking about this evening. I'm going to start about this place down here. It's called the Seren site in El Salvador. And that site has been very interesting because it was covered by volcanic ash. Some people call it the Pompeii of Central America, because the whole, it was just a village, just a farming village, but it was covered by volcanic ash. And like all the remains of the houses and their agricultural fields, they're all preserved in the volcanic ash. So we really learned a lot about the Maya and also Maya agriculture from that site. I'll also be talking about Tikal a great deal, and then some about Calakmul, which is our latest project. We just had a summer field season there, and we'll be going back again next summer. So most people throughout time have thought that the Maya lived by more or less swidden agriculture. And the reason they thought that's kind of what the Maya do there. The Maya are still with us. They haven't died off or anything. The Maya are still with us, but this is how they survive. They survived on swidden agriculture. And the way swidden agriculture works is you burn down a stretch of the forest, and then it sort of looks like this, and then you plant it, and then then corn crops up, and this works for maybe a couple of years, and the ash that falls from the forest, fertilizes the fields so that they can grow successfully. But it only lasts maybe 2 or 3 years, and then they have to go to another stretch of forest and cut that down, and then start the cycle all over again. And it works fine if you have enough for about 20 years. So you don't come back to the original place for about 20 years, and then everything works fine. But if you have to cut it short, it doesn't work very well. And so this is fine when you have a small population and you have a lot of land and you can cycle around in 20 years. You can imagine if you had to really have like 10 years worth of fields instead of just one. And so this is something that people have been looking at, and now with LIDAR, and LIDAR is a new sensing technique. Perhaps if anybody looks at National Geographic or anything like that, LIDAR is a way that they can fly over the surface of the land, and they shoot images or lasers down from the surface. And depending on the wavelength of those lasers, they can either see the ground surface or they can see the tops of trees. And so because of this, they've been able to find many, many more archaeological sites in the Maya area than they could in the past. And it's like a miracle, really. So we know that this area was once very, very heavily populated, and there's no way that this kind of agriculture could have fed all of those people. So this begs the question, what did the Maya do? Well, we have some answers, not all of them, but some. And as I promised, we'll talk a little bit about Seren. And this is one of the households at Seren. This is household 1. And this site was found years ago. They were excavating for a silo complex. And all these things started coming out of the side of the hill. And they started to get pottery and thatch. And then they found a bone, and they thought, oh, everything looks so fresh. They thought, oh my gosh, there was a murder here. And so they called in the police, and the police said, no, that was not the problem. Am I standing in the wrong place?
No, we've got a pop-up screen
Oh.
here that says not now.
Okay, all right. There we go. I should be looking more carefully. Thank you. So anyway, they brought in some archaeologists, and they said, no, this is not a murder. This is not modern. This stuff is ancient. And it turns out that this village was from the late Classic period, right around AD 600, sort of at the apogee of the Maya experience. And so we have this area, and it's all covered with about 3 or 4 meters of volcanic ash, like up to the ceiling. This whole village was just covered, so we have to dig deep down into these pits, and I'll show you pictures. And but the great thing is we can see where the fields were, and we see where all the artifacts were and their houses and so forth. So this is a diagram of household 1, and these are all the different houses. The one up on top there, that was a sleeping area. This was a sort of food storage, and then this was a kitchen here. And then these are some other sleeping areas. And all these places where you see guava, these are actual places where we found evidence of the trees. We didn't just make all this up, which is usually what happens. All of these places where you see names, we found evidence where those plants were actually growing. So we have a very good idea of what it looked like in their households. And of course, they had some trees like manioc and guava. These are small trees, but they're of course productive. They get nice fruits from these things. The Maya were very practical. Their gardens, they would have some flowers, but their flowers would mostly be medicinal. So that everything that they would have growing in their gardens or huertas, they were practical things. They were something they could use, and most of it was food. And and here you would have the Mesoamerican triad, maize, beans, and squash. But also you would have agave, and this plant, which was, could not figure this out. We had so many plaster casts of this thing, malanga, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And I finally figured it out, but it just drove me crazy for over a year. And so they had trees for shade and fruit, and then they also had little garden patches that were intensively tended. And also they would be fertilized with night soil, if you will. That's the euphemism for when people go outside and to the bathroom in their maize fields. But it's a system that worked very well. And this system was a good part of their intensive agriculture. And this is that plant I told you about. This is malanga, Xanthosomas agitafolium. And it produces these nice little tubers here that I've had them. They can be quite large, and they're really pretty good. They taste a lot like, a little bit like sweet potatoes. And they're very nutritious. And I saw that we had hundreds of these casts. And what the archaeologists would do is they would dig down in the ash. And then when they would find a hole in the ash, they would fill it up with dental plaster. And then you would get things like this. And I saw this thing and I knew it was a monocot, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And I looked through all my books and I was trying to figure this out. And then one day I was at one of their national parks, and the ranger who was at the national park had a little garden in his backyard. And in that garden, he had this plant, and this is the plant here. And of course, the leaves were destroyed by the ash. So you just had the stems there, and that's what we were looking at. And that's what this is. And they had these things planted all over the place. And so this was an important crop. And one of the points I want to make is that the Maya didn't just rely on corn, beans, and squash. They had a lot of root crops that they used, and this is just one of them. And also, so this is the area right here. This is where the households were. This is the little village, if you will. And then they had all of these areas out here where extensive fields, and they grew them in ridge and furrow agricultural terms. So they had ridge and furrow agriculture, which had not been seen before in the Maya area. And this is a manioc field, for example, and you can see that that's one of my friends, and she's down at about 3 meters underground here, and you can see all the layers of ash on the side. But this shows the large ridge that would be manioc. You may not be familiar with that plant, manioc, but we eat it something like tapioca.
Isn't it in Africa too?
Well, it's native to the Americas. You're right, in Africa, they grow it like crazy. In Africa, this is one of the most, manioc is one of the most productive crops in the world in terms of calories per acre. It's a root crop, and it doesn't have a lot of vitamins and proteins and things like that, but starch, it has it aplenty. So, and this is how you would grow it. And manioc needs to be drained, so they had these furrows between the ridges that would drain off the water, and then you could plant the manioc on the ridges, and we would actually find the manioc stems there. And these are the cornfields here, and they were also grown in ridge and furrow. And here you can see all the little corn plants. They were, the molds have been gone or taken away now, but these were ridge and furrow. And also this shows the layers of ash that came down. And so these were wonderful finds. So we really learned a lot about their agriculture. And these were some of the stems. The one on the right, that's a manioc stem. And then the one over here on the left is a maize stem. You can see the cobs very clearly. Now, this is one of the things that has puzzled archaeologists and archaeobotanists for decades. This is an aerial view of the Blue Creek area of northwestern Belize. And you see all these squares in here. What the heck is going on? And this area is kind of marshy, and it's sort of in a river valley, but it's got a very high water table, and people suspected they might be agriculture, but it's not clear exactly how this all developed. But fortunately, going through the photographs here at the Lloyd Library, we had photographs from Curtis Lloyd, and he took pictures of a place in Mexico. It's called Xochimilco, and it's just south of Mexico City. And these chinampas were actually built by the Aztecs. So this is something that people continue to use today, but they were actually first built by the Aztecs. And what they do is, this is another place where you have a high water table. And what you do is you muck out the canals and you throw that muck up onto these little islands. And then as you do that, you've got some blue-green algae in here, and that fertilizes, that adds nitrogen. And then the muck from the bottom of the canal. And this creates a very fertile field. The roots go down, they don't have that far to go to hit the water table. So this is a very effective and sustainable kind of agriculture. And what the Aztecs did is they would plant trees along the edges to try to stabilize the banks here so they don't continuously collapse. And so fortunately, Curtis Lloyd was there about, I think it was 1902. Patricia, do you remember the exact?
That sounds right.
It is 1902. And so this was, we're getting a real glimpse back into history here. And here's some pictures of, so these canals were not only useful for agriculture, but they were also like the highways of the past. And I love this picture here. We have people with the dugout canoe in front. This is, this is like 120 years ago, but it seems like another world. And this area is still used in a very similar way. And here's another picture. Notice that this guy, they have these little flat bottom boats because it's not very deep, and they're using poles to move themselves through the water. And this guy is obviously doing an earth moving project here. He's got his flat bottom boat almost filled. And so he's adding his dirt someplace where it's needed. And this is the location of Xochimilco. It used to be like a separate community. And there's Mexico City, what is now modern Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. And that was exact where it says Mexico City. That was the capital of the ancient, or of the Aztecs, and it was Tenochtitlan. And Texcoco over on the right, that was one of the allies of the Aztecs. And the people here in Xochimilco were connected to Mexico City by a series of canals. And so there were canals through this whole area. This whole area was once a great big lake. And there was a big flood about 1600, and the Spaniards decided it was time to drain the lake. And so since that time, they've been draining water away, and there's more land was created. And unfortunately, it's that drainage is going to reduce the chinampas at Xochimilco. But this whole area was once a very productive place for the Aztecs. And it still is, although, you know, through NAFTA and so forth, the price of maize has gone so low that a lot of Mexican farmers don't raise maize anymore because it's cheaper to buy it on the open market. And so what they do in Xochimilco is they grow flowers because they can be sold locally. And so, and this is the, you know, these are like 1900, 1902 taxi cabs here in Xochimilco, and they're moving people around. And they still do this kind of thing today. And this is an example of what the place looks like today. You can see these are the taxi cabs of today. And it's like a traffic jam. There's so many people use the canals. It's absolutely amazing. They still fish from it, as you see up here, and they probably used the canals this way in the past. They would have fish in the canals, and so that was a good source of protein. They have still used the flat bottom boats, and you can see the agricultural land in the background there, so they still use that. Now, part of this land is preserved as a nature preserve, and that's sort of what this guy is doing with his kayak. And actually, this whole area is a World Heritage Center. But there's constant battles with the UN and the Mexican government because they see that the water levels keep going down and down, and the Mexican government is not doing as much as they could to prevent that from happening. So there's a constant conflict. And this underscores the value of a lot of the images that Curtis Lloyd produced for us in 1902. So we have a record of what was happening in this area because it's changing very rapidly. Okay, this is Temple 1. There you go. This is Temple 1 at Tigard. It does look like the other one. No doubt about it. There's a similarity. And we did a project. I worked with a number of wonderful colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, Nick Dunning and Vern Scarborough. And we did a project in 2010, 2009, 2011. We're still working on it. We're still doing things at that site. But we were very fortunate to have permission to work there. It's very hard to get a permit to work in this area because this is one of the most cherished archaeological sites in Guatemala. And it's very hard when you're from North America to get permission to work there, but they seem to, well, I think one of the reasons they liked us is that we weren't going to dig in any of the temples, that we mostly dug in the reservoirs and out in trash pits and things like that, looking for plant remains. So they figured, oh yeah, let them go do that. So I think that was one reason they let us in. Okay, so we learned a whole bunch about Maya agriculture. One thing we saw were terraces. There's a system of terraces there and down here. And it turns out that terracing is something that was used in many ways by the Maya. Now, we don't have as much evidence here at Tikal. We do have some, but there are other sites that have terraces everywhere, like the Caracol site in Belize and the Chan site also in Belize. And terracing is a great way, very sustainable agriculture. And so this is certainly one way that the Maya made their agriculture more sustainable. Another aspect here is this is kind of like a little peninsula, and this is stuck out into like a marsh And this is what they call bajos. They're seasonal wetlands. And, because in this area, it rains like crazy for part of the year. And then for part of the year, it doesn't rain at all or very little. And so you have this real seasonality. And during the dry season, this area dries out. But when the rains come, it fills up with water. And so people thought, oh, this is crazy. You can't use that for agriculture. But the Maya did. The Maya definitely used it for agriculture. And here, this is a pollen profile from the place I just showed you. And it shows two important things. It shows they were growing maize in this area, and also, a surprise, another root crop, Canna indica. And so we're going to see more root crops. And this is Canna indica, and this is the perfect crop for this place because you can, and it's not only attractive, but it produces a nice little tuber that is very nutritious. And this is called achira in Spanish, or it's called arrowroot.
This is arrowroot. Cool.
Yes, there you go. And so what happens is you can plant this thing when the ground is still wet. And even if the ground dries out, you can still get a crop. It'll still continue to grow. And this is fantastic because you can imagine as these wetlands dry out, the water slowly recedes. You plant the achira one by one as the water is receding. And then at the end of the dry season, you get a nice crop. So they use this very effectively. Okay, so now this is the site core, and this shows all of the drainage areas here. And we're going to talk about these two big reservoirs here. This is where all the big buildings are, and this is the great plaza where Temple 1 was that I showed you. And so this is really the center of Tikal, and they managed their water very well. So they had reservoirs all around the city. They had one here, Perdido, Corriental, and several others. And we're going to talk about Temple and Palace Reservoir. We didn't study them all, but we did study 4 of them rather intensively. So we really understand the history of what was happening there. Oh, one thing I do want to go back and show you that these reservoirs, all of these areas are paved here. They had like plaster floors, and they canted the plaster floors so that when the rains came down in the rainy season, the water drained down into these 2 reservoirs. So it was like a big funnel. They had, so all these plaza areas were like a big funnel, and they filled it with water. And so this is a small area, but they capture literally all the water, and it would go into the reservoirs. Okay, and this is a LiDAR image, what I talked about, where you have the plane flying over and it bounces laser beams of lasers off of the ground, and then you get an actual reflection. So this shows you where all of the buildings are, as if there were no trees. It sort of clears away all the vegetation for you. Okay, ooh. I wanted to talk about this area is a place. This is called the Mundo Perdido, the lost world, because it was so unusual. The first Spaniards who saw this said, why, this is weird over here in the corner, but it's actually, this was one of the first areas that was constructed. This is the oldest part of Tikal here. And one thing that's interesting, there's a wall around it, and there's a notch in the wall. And then from the notch in that wall, there's a canal that brings it down to this reservoir here. And it's a very effective system. And this reservoir, we noticed that it was kind of weird because it had a lot of trash in it. Why would you have trash in a reservoir that you use for drinking water? Well, it turns out it wasn't used for drinking water. It was used for agriculture. So they had set up an agricultural system based on this reservoir. And so here's a close-up of that. There's the Perdido Reservoir. And here are some test pits that we used. And we did things, we looked at carbon isotopes, and we had an intensification of carbon isotopes, the kind that are only produced by maize in this area. So this squiggly line here shows that they were growing maize down in this area. And then also we did a test pit right here, Operation 8D, and here's what we found. This is sort of the normal Bajo soils here. But once you get to up around AD 500, which is when the reservoir was built, suddenly it turns into an alluvial thing, meaning that you see when you have all these laminated soils here, they were flooding the area. So what they would do is they would flood the area. I mean, it was crude to us, you know, where we have the sprinklers and all of that stuff. But they would just open the reservoir and let water out, and they would let the water flood the agricultural land. And this is the evidence that show that that's what they were doing. So, and what's kind of interesting about this is because it was all connected to the site core, this was probably the ruler who's doing all this. So this was centrally controlled water system here. This is not somebody who figured it out with his buddies. This was something that was a top-down deal. And think of the power that would have conveyed to the ruler, because now we can grow 2 crops a year in this one place where we only used to be able to grow 1 crop a year. And so that must have been a very strong statement of power. Okay, here's another thing that we found, and this is the wood of chocolate tree. Now, it's long been thought that at Tikal they would not grow chocolate. Now, chocolate was one of the most important crops for the ancient Maya because it was involved in almost all of their ceremonies, and it was a status symbol, and it was very important to them. But it was believed that Tikal has this really hot season, and cacao is a finicky plant. It does not like heat, has to be moist all the time. So people thought, no way can they grow cacao at Tikal. Well, we found the wood there. We found the seeds also. I mean, the seeds could have been transported in, but not the wood. The wood is pretty useless. You might use it for firewood, but it's soft and it's just not good for anything except maybe just making tortillas. And so the only reason this wood would be there is if they were growing it somewhere in the area. And so the question is, where were they growing it? And it looks like a good example of this. These are all real reservoirs, like Tikal Reservoir over here. This place, though, and we found that the charcoal very near this place probably was not a reservoir. It was actually a sinkhole. And you would say, well, how do you know it's not a reservoir? Well, a reservoir is kind of like a swimming pool, where you have it, they had to pave it at the bottom because the land is otherwise very porous. And so they had to have a plaster pavement on the bottom. And a lot of times they would have flagstones also on the bottom, and then put clay in between the flagstones. But this reservoir, or this area, had no flagstones, it had no bottom. So it was not a reservoir. But we believe that the Maya, actually, this was Nick Dunning's idea. I can't grab all the credit there. But his idea was that this area was a rejoyada, which is a place that's a special place for the Maya. And they have sinkholes. This area is mostly karst, meaning that it's calcium carbonate. It's a former seabed. And there are places where the underbedding collapses and you get these deep holes. And probably the inscriptions reservoir was a sinkhole or a rejoyada. And see, in these sinkholes, they create a very special environment because they're down low and they stay very moist. And the upper trees could protect the lower trees, like these are cacao trees. And this is quite possibly where the Maya were growing their cacao. Now, we want to go back and test that hypothesis, but I think it's really a good one. In fact, I can't wait for that opportunity. So this was another kind of opportunity that the Maya had to grow specialty crops and do it very intensively. Okay, so let's talk about their reservoirs. Now, I mentioned that all of these surfaces, they're all paved, right? And all that water goes into these reservoirs. And it sounds like a good idea, right? But you know, the problem with a lot of good ideas is they have unintended consequences. And some of the unintended consequences really came back to haunt the Maya. Now, here's a picture. This is from Peter Harrison's book in 1999, on the Maya kings. And this shows, and he excavated here, that there was a kitchen right along the palace reservoir. I mean, this was a good idea in some respects, right? Because, you know, it would be easy for the cooks in the kitchen to get water and cook up the tamales and so forth. And that's what they did, undoubtedly. But unfortunately, the cooks threw the waste materials out the window, like along the edge here. And we know that because there's a big midden there, so where it has waste products. And so what happens in the rainy season, right? When they're throwing all this waste out the window. So a lot of this waste material is going to wash down into the palace reservoir. And what happens when you have all this organic material flowing into the reservoir, you get elevated nitrogen levels. We can't measure nitrogen because nitrogen doesn't hang around very well, but phosphate does. It's a good proxy for organic contamination. And what you see here in the Palace Reservoir, this is pre-classic, not too much contamination. And then you get into the terminal classic, late classic, woo, goes way up. So you get a lot of contamination as indicated by the phosphate levels there. And what did that do? Well, we went to DNA technology to answer some of these questions. And I'm happy to say at the University of Cincinnati, we developed this technique applying environmental DNA to archaeological problems. And what we do is under certain circumstances, DNA will be preserved because it wraps around clay particles. And we developed a way to extract the DNA and develop probes so that we could analyze what the DNA is. And one of our studies, and here we are collecting DNA samples from the pits. Now, I have to say, those reservoirs, you think, I say reservoir, right? And you imagine, oh, there's a bunch of water there, and that's what the reservoir is. Today, all those reservoirs are filled up with muck. They're all filled, and actually they're, you know, soil on top. So you can be standing in the middle of the reservoir and it looks level with everything else because it's all filled in with sediment and soil. So anyway, so to get down to the bottom, where the bottom of the reservoir is, we have to dig down often several meters. And here I am taking samples out of the profile. And see, as you take samples out of the profile, the lowest one is the earliest and the uppermost one is the most recent. So you get a sort of a span of history when you do that. And one of the things we were looking at was cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. Anybody heard the reports from like anybody live in Toledo at any point? Nobody from Toledo, but you may have read in the newspapers where Toledo has a lot of problems with algal blooms in Lake Erie, right? Well, keep your, anyway, it happens there. And the problem with the area of Lake Erie where Toledo is, it's very, very shallow water, and the water gets kind of stagnant in that shallow area. Anyway, so they have cyanobacteria blooms or blue-green algal blooms, and apparently the Maya did too. And I should say that towards the end of of the late Classic period. The Maya, it's got into a period of severe drought. And they had several droughts that were multi-decadal, like 20-year droughts, which is hard for us to imagine, but this actually happened, and we have very good evidence to show that. And one of the things that happened is that their reservoirs became contaminated with blue-green algae. And part of that was that the Maya themselves created a nutrient broth for the blue-green algae because they're throwing all this organic material into the water. And so what happened, and this is a record of the blue-green algae. Now we have several episodes, like this one, Planktothrix, late pre-classic. This is another dry period. And then we have this one here, the late classic. We have several in the late classic. And this Planktothrix and Microcystis, they produce very toxic poisons. They produce microcystins, and they are very deadly. And one drop on your tongue would kill you. And so what happened is you could not drink the water. And what's really bad about these microcystins is you can't even boil the water and drink it because they're heat resistant. So it's really a bad situation. And so they had numerous episodes of this cyanobacteria. Oh, I better move along here. And so their reservoirs would look like this. This was an iguana in southern Mexico where it really dried out, and the water got very stagnant, and they had a nice algal bloom there. They had another problem in their reservoirs. Remember, I said that the water drained off of all of those big buildings. Well, the Maya did something that you wouldn't think about probably, but they used something called cinnabar. And this stuff contains mercury. It's mercury sulfide. And this mercury sulfide was painted on a lot of their buildings. And you can imagine what happens when you get this horrendous rainfall coming, hitting all these buildings painted with cinnabar, and all of this cinnabar is washing down into the reservoirs. And what happens now, this pink thing in the back, this is the population bulge. Like in the late Classic period, there was a real spike in population in Tikal. This was like one of the major cities of the ancient Maya world. But these bars represent the amount of mercury. And this little red line here, this is the toxic effect threshold. So anything above this line is going to produce a toxic effect. And you can see here that you have, in the late Classic period, you have maybe 17 times the toxic effect threshold there. So they really had a huge problem with mercury. And I'll show you what this looks like. This is a picture of cinnabar. And it's a beautiful color, right? I mean, if you wanted to use something as a pigment, this would be great. And the Maya were, I hate to say it, were obsessed with things that were blood colored for religious reasons. And so the buildings might have looked something like this. And so there's now, not all of that would be cinnabar, a lot of that would be hematite, but some of it would be cinnabar, and it could wash down into their reservoirs. And one of the effects of chronic mercury poisoning is called a metabolic syndrome. And obesity is a known side effect of this syndrome, and it's caused by chronic mercury poisoning. And this is one of the last rulers of Tikal. And this guy would probably grew up and had tamales every day that were laced with mercury. And so this possibly explains why he looked the way he did. And you would think that with the blue-green algae and with the mercury, sort of not, it really plays with your mind. So these guys may not have had, probably not playing with a full deck And it would have been very hard to explain the green algae. And how would you explain that? And people would have thought that maybe the gods are not happy with you. And the ruler's job was to interface between the gods and bring the rains at the right time and make sure everybody had a good harvest. And if that wasn't happening, they would probably turn to their rulers and blame them for it. Okay, so I'm painting a lot of doom and gloom here, but I do want to say that the Maya lived there for 2,000 years. And they developed agricultural systems that were more and more sustainable through time. And so they created very sustainable systems. There were some things that happened, though, that they couldn't control very well, like the droughts that came in the late 9th century, and also the cyanobacteria and the mercury. These were all complex challenges that they didn't really understand. Now, if you want to draw a modern analogy, we've been here for 200 years, and we can already see that there are a lot of unsustainable things happening in our country. And we could talk about that if you like. But the Maya were there for 2,000 years, so they developed a very sustainable kind of agriculture. Just some of the things happened and things went off the rails. And so the Maya had a complex array of challenges, pollution, leadership issues, and drought that ultimately led to the abandonment of Tikal. Okay, well, I'm going to end it there, and thank you very much for being so kind and patient. I'd like to hear any questions you might have. Thank you. Oh. Okay, never mind. I had a few more I wanted to show, but never mind. No, that's
Sure?
okay. Yeah, we'll just, I think we're over time anyway.
No, you're good. Any questions?
The cob of corn that you showed,
Yeah.
that was early classic, is that right? Because
That was,
the kernels were very small, closer to the original corn than the modern corn.
a very, very interesting observation. It was late classic, but this is a very good idea. The early cobs were much smaller. It's possible that they were immature cobs. And they probably were not fully developed. And I think that's the reason why, but great observation. Thank you. That's it. Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that they put non-human organic waste into composting systems as opposed to throwing it in the water?
Let's see. What I know is they usually would throw their waste sort of in the back of their houses. That usually each house compound would have a sort of a place in the back, if you will, and that's where they would throw their waste. Now, whether they were deliberately composting or not, I mean, certainly they could throw their waste on the fields too, like at Saran, they probably did that. And they definitely put their night soil in, well, we have ethnographic evidence that they would have done that. So there were ways that they would have tried to enrich their fields through composting, not in a way that we're thinking of, but in a sort of a more natural, organic way. That's a good question, though. I think you had a question, ma'am?
You referred to the lining of the reservoirs as being paved, but also plaster. What is that substance? Could you
Well,
also repeat the question?
Okay, the question is, what was the material that made up the lining of the reservoirs? The Maya made a substance out of limestone, crushed limestone. And when you heat it, yeah, it's like cement. When you heat it, I think it becomes like calcium hydroxide. And then when you mix that with water, it's like a plaster. And that's what they would use to line the bottom of these reservoirs. Now, also, sometimes they would put in like flagstones, right? And so they would pave it with flagstones and then get clay out of the bajos and then stuff the cracks with clay. They would do that as well. But most of the ones in the center of the city were plastered with like lime, it's called. Yeah, so I mean, they did a lot of things there. Yes, sir.
Do you have any evidence of whether those were natural low areas or did they excavate to make them?
Ah, excellent question. Excellent question. And the question is, where are the areas where they put the reservoirs? Were they natural depressions or were they excavated? And the answer is both. That they were natural depressions and the Maya would go in and enhance them. For example, the Aguada that was near the Terminos settlement, what they did was it was just sort of a depression in the Bajo, and what they did is they would go and dig it out and then create a lip around the depression. So they sort of doubled the size. So that's one way they would do it. And also at the, like the Palace Reservoir, that whole area was like a ravine originally. And what happened was the Maya kept widening that ravine, and they would widen the ravine because they had to have something to build all those temples with. And they would take it out of these, like the Palace Reservoir, and made it much, much bigger than it was originally. So yes, so absolutely it would be partly man-made, and it would also be part of the natural feature. Yes, sir.
You spoke of the plants, you meant to use the word fish. Do you grow fish?
Well, in the, like at the Chinampas, the question is.
Oh, and also, can I just step a few feet over? That way, the Zoom audience will see your head.
Okay. They're probably better off not seeing it, but. Okay, so the fish, right, so in the Chinampas, they would have fish in the canals, right? Now, the fish around Tikal, we do find some fish bones there, but it is thought that those fish may have been dried and came from the coast. Because at Tikal, there's not a lot of fish there because the wet areas, the bajos, they dry out during the dry season. And so the fish couldn't survive. So I don't think the fish population was very big. There were fish bones at Tikal, so they were coming in from some places. And there's a Lake Petanitza is not too far away. It's like 20 miles away. They could have come from there as well. So yeah, good question. Okay, yes, sir.
I was curious about Chichen Itza. Is that a well or could it have been a reservoir?
Well, that is one of those rejolladas that we were talking about. That's a natural sinkhole.
Okay.
And that is like a really big one. That is like the granddaddy of all the sinkholes. And what happens was, you just get a weakness in the underbedding, and a lot of times there are these limestone caverns underground, and they collapse, and then you get a big hole like at Chichen Itza. Yeah, so that was natural, and it's all lined with stone. I wouldn't be surprised if the Maya didn't take some stone out of there too. So they probably enhanced it as well. So the answer is probably both. Okay, so any other questions? All right, well, listen, thank you so much. You've been very patient, and I appreciate you coming out.
Well, I'd like to thank David Lentz. That was fascinating. And also our audience, both here and our Zoom audience. If you want to hear more from David on Mesoamerican history and culture, and by the way, my apologies for not describing you as an archaeologist, an anthropologist.
I'm both.
You are, but the
archaeobotanics.
archaeology really came through and I really appreciated that. But David is featured on the latest episode of our podcast, episode 11, called Between the Leaves. And you can get it on our website or you can get it wherever you get your podcasts.